Thank you all for being here today over Parents Weekend. I want to thank members of the library's Programming and Communications Committee and Ernesto Valencia for their work on this program, and the School of Journalism and the NU Bookstore for their co-sponsorship of this program. Please help us to support the Meet the Author series by becoming a library supporter. Just so you know, we're filming today's program, and it's going to be broadcast on Northeastern's YouTube channel as well as iTunes University. We appreciate your feedback as well, so please take a few moments. There's a comment card that will be passed around, and if you could please fill that out, that really helps to inform our future programming. We are delighted to bring Lynne Joiner here today. She's an Emmy Award-winning broadcast journalist, news anchor, and documentary filmmaker. Lynne's work has included assignments for CBS, NBC, ABC, CNN, NPR, Newsweek, and Los Angeles Times Magazine. She is currently a media consultant for Shanghai International TV Channel. Lynne's book, Honorable Survivor, grew out of her lifelong interest in China. After meeting Foreign Service Officer John Service and his wife and learning about his talks with Chairman Mao during World War II, Lynne resolved to tell his story. As we celebrate the centennial of Co-op at Northeastern and look to expand the program even further globally, I am excited to hear about this international true story. I know we have some journalism professors and students in attendance who I am sure are looking forward to hearing about Lynne's investigative reporting and telling the story of an honorable survivor. Please join me in welcoming Lynne.
Very much. It's like my old days anchoring. I get to put a microphone on and try and remember how to twist it properly. And put it up high enough so you can hear. Okay. Well, thank all of you for coming on this chilly day. This is very exciting for me to be here at Northeastern University. I went to Cornell, and I have to confess, I didn't even know you guys existed. I'm from Southern California, and I live in San Francisco. And then I Googled you, and I went, oh my God, this is a big, serious, wonderful school. So I'm delighted to be here, especially on Parents Weekend. So thank you for coming. It was a long time in the making, and there's a lot in it that will help give you some understanding of the fabric of our lives in terms of how the world that we live in today was created out of a convergence of events and personalities and off-the-radar things that you can never anticipate. And I try to always start by telling people that even though the events in the story to a large extent happened 50, 60 years ago, John Service's experiences and his story are a cautionary tale that are relevant today. And when you go out, if you look at the book, if you turn it over on the back, there are some wonderful endorsements. I didn't pay them, honest. But the former East Asian, the Assistant Secretary of State for East Asian Affairs at the State Department said that there were resonances in his experience in China and in McCarthy's America for our experience right now with Afghanistan and Pakistan and Iraq and Iran. And she also said, Susan Shirk is the name of the woman, she said, I can't wait to see the movie. So that's what I'm going to be working on once I get off the book tour. I really would love to bring this to the screen because my love is film. My father was a writer, director, producer in Hollywood, and I hope someday that I will have you all come to the premiere. We'll see. But besides being this wonderful story, it's also just a good tale set against a backdrop of war and romance and international intrigue and Washington skullduggery. And it just proves that fact is stranger than fiction. And I have to start by re-emphasizing, I knew this man personally. We met at a symposium at Stanford University 33 years ago on the hot topic should America recognize Red China? And his wife came up to me at a coffee break to introduce them to me because they had recently seen a documentary film I had made in China early in December 75 and early January 76. And I was there at the time of the death of one of the real revolutionary cadre, Zhou Enlai, who was the premier. And there were no other American correspondents there for all you journalist students. And I had the unusual experience of reporting back live to the ABC, NBC, and CBS News that night because I worked for Westinghouse, which was affiliated with each of those different networks. So I had studied enough about China that I really felt I was lucky to be in the right place at the right time. It was quite exciting. But back to Jack's service, and that's what his friends called him. After that first meeting, we met professionally a number of times. I interviewed him, and it grew into a very special relationship, a friendship with Jack and Carolyn Service. And in 1978 December, when it was finally announced that there would be official diplomatic relations, 7 years after the famous handshake between Nixon and Mao, I was with them for lunch, and Jack ordered a bottle of champagne, and we toasted the friendship of the Chinese and American people. And he first started to tell me about his long conversations in the guerrilla caves of Yan'an, behind enemy lines, when Mao expressed his great desire to have a friendly relationship with the U.S. and be allied with them against the Japanese, and how much he hoped to avoid civil war and get American businessmen to help rebuild their war-torn country. I also was with the services in June of 1989 as we watched tanks roll through Beijing and through Tiananmen Square, and Jack expressed his profound disappointment with the evolution of the Chinese Revolution that he had seen in its infancy during World War II. Nevertheless, even though we were friends, I am a trained investigative reporter, and it took me 4 years to get FBI and State Department security files under Freedom of Information Act. And I found out things that Jack never knew, and I found out things that he chose not to remember. The ordeal that he went through lasted this long. It all started, he was born in Sichuan province in Chengdu, and to get there in 1906 when his parents arrived, you came in on a ship in Shanghai, and then it was a 4-month journey up the Yangtze River to Chongqing, and then it was 250 miles overland to get to Chengdu. And this is how you traveled. This was modern transportation. And by the time Jack was 10, he could walk it. He refused to be carried on the shoulders of Chinese, and he and his father would walk alongside. They'd have to have guards because there were bandits, there were roving bands of warlord armies, there were starving peasants, there were the heads of bandits on poles to remind everybody not to do it. There were 3 boys who were raised by Bob and Grace Service. Bob started the YMCA in Chengdu in 1906. And like all foreigners in China, they lived in a little bit of a protective cocoon. And even today, if you travel to China, if you don't speak Chinese, you still feel a little bit wrapped in saran wrap unless you can break through that. And fortunately, I've been there in and out for 30 years, and I have seen big changes just in the personal lives of people I know. We can talk about today China later if you want, but let me roll through as fast as I can on this story because I want to give you an idea of why I hope you will find it a fascinating tale, as I did. His first post in the Foreign Service was as a lowly clerk in this boondock place called Yunnan-Fu, which is now Kunming, out in Yunnan province. And he was able to finally get a job and send for his college sweetheart, who came all by herself to China, got to this boondock place in southwest China and hated it, really suffered culture shock, and went and lived with his parents in Shanghai for 6 months till she kind of could get adjusted. Eventually, he was his ticket into the official Foreign Service came, and he went to Beijing and studied Chinese for 3 years, and then he was posted to Shanghai. But in 1940, because of the Japanese war against the Chinese, which we still were not a party to, all American dependents, including his wife, his widowed mother, and his 2 small children, he oversaw the evacuation of them from occupied Shanghai, which was under control of the Japanese. And as soon as they were gone, he volunteered for duty in the war capital of the nationalists, who had been pushed back from their capital in Nanjing to Hankou, and then finally up the Yangtze River to Chongqing. And when it looks so ludicrous, this is what they call a ladder street. It's very hilly. He's wearing the tux for the official credentialing of the new ambassador. He borrowed the hat from a British embassy fellow and had to stuff it with newspaper to make it fit. But what this picture doesn't show you is every single day from 1938 through 1941, the Japanese bombers would arrive and bomb the city. And they had no air force. General Chennault and the Flying Tigers were soon to come. But there was always a problem of how you get supplies in. The Japanese controlled the East Coast and the South Coast, and they had to bring supplies in over through what they called the back door and over what they euphemistically called the hump. So let me give you an idea of how hard it was. These are the drums of fuel. They had to be siphoned into 5-gallon cans and then poured in a funnel into the tanks in the wings. And the Americans bravely flew over 29,000-foot high mountains. Their planes would get iced. They had heavy loads. A number of them crashed. The Chinese, in years since the war, have tried very hard to find the wreckages and bring out dog tags and build memorials to them. I've seen books in China that are commemorating the heroism. The Americans were very upset because a lot of the supplies that they brought so perilously into China got sold on the black market by avaricious officials and officers of the nationalist Chinese army. John Service in his travels discovered that what was called Roosevelt cloth, which had been donated to help clothe the Chinese school children, was being dyed and sold at high prices in tailor shops. I just remembered I forgot to put up my book, and I want to read to you a few passages. So just for a second, I got to turn away. Sorry about that. But on his travels, he was asked to go by the Chinese up to a distant oil well field in northwest China. And he was the only American, only foreigner, with a group of engineers and 3 journalists, Chinese journalists. And it was the first time on this 8-week trip he got to know Chinese as friends. He broke through that saran wrap I talked about. They let him call them by their first names. And they spoke about Chinese history in Chinese, because he's fluent, and they talked about the war and everything. And this is what he said, or what I wrote about. Sorry about that. It's a very narrow thing I'm trying to work off of here. But it's important for you to have this background as I move ahead in my talk. He discovered the depth of their disenchantment with the increasingly repressive nationalist regime and their fears for the future. All assumed that the U.S. would easily defeat Japan and that Chiang Kai-shek would then renew his civil war against the communists. As a result of these candid conversations, another Chinese puzzle piece fell into place for the diplomat. Chiang's reluctance to embrace General Stilwell's plan for a strong counteroffensive might reflect his desire to preserve his troops and stockpile American arms and equipment for a renewed battle against the communists. Until American observers could reach communist-controlled areas to assess their capabilities, the China puzzle would never be fully understood. I felt I had a special kind of linkage and insight, Service later observed. Was this the seed of hubris? Possibly. So on we go, and as I said, it was very difficult. There we go. What happened? Oops. I apologize. I'm having a little bit of gremlin problem today, but we can fix this, I hope, by going here. There we go, finally. Sorry. There was a big dispute over the proper strategy to follow, air or ground war. We still wrestle with air or ground war. Remember Iraq? And this China theater was the lowest priority theater. Europe was first, then Africa. We had the campaign in Africa. John Service was assigned to become a political advisor to General Stilwell. This is General Stilwell here. This is General Chennault of Flying Tiger fame. They had an incredible dispute that spilled over into their two staffs, which ended up being sort of a them versus us. And the American policy was split up not only between the military but between other agencies of the U.S. But his job was to brief correspondents and give them a bit of understanding of the real background of what was happening in China, because the propagandists for the nationalists controlled things, and very few foreigners other than Service and a few others actually escaped and went out and traveled public buses on their own and got to see things. All right, I'd be happy to do so. Part of it is I'd like people to read the book to get some of the background to it. At one point in the 20s, the Chinese nationalists and the Chinese communists were allied, and they all wanted to do two things. They wanted to unify the country against this terrible war zone that had been created because of the weakness of the last Chinese dynasty, which ended in 1911, and the warlords who controlled various parts of China. And both of those parties were trained to a large extent by the Soviets. And there was a big break in 1927, and a bitter civil war began. And the Chinese communists were almost completely surrounded and defeated. They tried to follow a theoretical base of communists based on an industrial base like in Europe, and they got slaughtered in Shanghai, and they were scattered, and Chiang Kai-shek, who was the head of the Nationalist Revolutionary Army, declared them red bandits, and they were out there trying to escape. They went on what was called the Long March, and it's been glorified and made very heroic. It was really a desperate attempt to escape annihilation, and they wound up in the central part of northern China. The headquarters was developed in Yan'an, and that's where we're going to pick up the story again. Did I do okay? No, I appreciate that, because it is important. I'm just working against the clock with a very complicated story that I got to bring up to the present time, and I know some people have to leave early. So stay with me if you can. If you have to leave, I understand. But the thing that makes John Service so fascinating to me is he became a convergence point for many different factors. The Chinese Civil War, the communists and the nationalists, the disillusionment after World War II and the beginning of the Cold War, and the fear of the Soviets, anti-communist Republican politicians who were tired of the Democrats being in power, and a whole bunch of other things. So on we go. John Service went back to Washington after this remarkable trip to the oil fields, where he discovered it would take as much gasoline if they refined. They wanted the U.S. to bring in a prefab oil refinery and truck it up to this remote oil well field and then use that oil for the war. Well, he discovered that if you did that, there wouldn't be any, by the time you went up and the time you came back down, you'd use up all the oil that field could produce. So he was negative in his report. The nationalists didn't like that, but it was an impractical situation. He went back to Washington, and he reported, though, about what he had heard and what he had heard in the tea rooms of complaints of peasants and ox cart drivers and his intellectual friends, the Chinese, and predicted that unless the Chinese communists, unless the Chinese nationalists went as far as the communists were supposedly going to reform things for the peasants, they might be a serious competitor if there were a civil war. And if civil war broke out before the war against Japan was finished, he feared that it would impede America's effort to defeat the Japanese. So there was a big conference in December of '43. Here's Roosevelt. This is Chiang Kai-shek. This is his Wellesley-educated wife, Madame Zhang, who spoke fluent English and acted as translator when they had these meetings. Behind them is General Eisenhower and General Stilwell, who became our top general in China. FDR became very disenchanted with Chiang Kai-shek, and he had already designated China and Zhang as the fourth pillar of democracy for the post-war world, and he never let go of that, but he found he was very disenchanted. This man could not decide to commit the troops that Stilwell said he needed. Off FDR went to meet with Stalin at another big summit in Tehran, and then he found that he could, quote, do business with Stalin. And he came back through Cairo and talked to Stilwell, who was complaining about the lack of cooperation he was getting, and he said, well, let's look for another man or other group of men to carry on. 6 months later, the Japanese offensive was really gaining steam and was threatening to overtake Chennault's forward air bases and even threaten the capital of Chongqing and the base where the backdoor supplies were coming in over the hump. And John Service was drafted by the Stilwell's chief of staff when a blunt, secret, eyes-only message came in for Chiang Kai-shek from FDR saying, you know, given the impending disaster, I think you need to appoint General Stilwell to be commander of all Allied forces in China, which meant also the Chinese Communists. And John Service, who was only a 32-year-old low-level diplomat, had to do the translation. And it was a very humiliating loss of face for the great leader of Free China to have this young whippersnapper telling him this. And Service did not think it would be an idea that would fly, because no Chinese, whether they were nationalists or Chinese communists, would have ever agreed to have a foreigner, given the history of foreign imperialism in China, command all their troops. However, Mao, well, I'm getting ahead of myself. John Service had had other run-ins with the nationalists. He had been pushing very hard to get observers to the communist area, but they needed the permission of Chiang Kai-shek. Roosevelt put pressure on him for that. Both of those events were just, as John Service called it, other nails in his coffin. Nevertheless, they finally got permission 18 months after Jack Service first recommended they send a mission to Yan'an behind enemy lines. And so he was the only diplomat on the first wave. This is the co-leader, Colonel Dave Barrett. And their appearance in Yan'an was de facto recognition of the other China. And this other China was off the radar screens here in the United States, and especially in Washington. And the U.S. Army was eager to have cooperation behind enemy lines because they were starting bombing raids. They needed help rescuing pilots. They needed information about weather intelligence so they'd know about the flights. They hoped the former organization called the OSS, which is a precursor of the CIA, they had secret members who were allegedly Army, who were really secret agents for the OSS, which was run out of the White House, who wanted to set up a radio intelligence network. They wanted to train saboteurs, and they wanted to send secret agents into as far as Tokyo with the help of the Chinese Communists. And so it was quite an ambitious agenda of observing and finding out if all the rumors of their heroic efforts were true or not. And when they arrived, there was a great sense of curiosity on both sides. The Chinese Communists had been isolated for more than, let's see, for 7 years because the Chinese nationalists had put some of their best troops on the border between the areas where the Chinese Communists were and where the nationalists were. And you have to understand, China was a patchwork quilt with different organizations and groups controlling territory, not unlike Afghanistan. We have the northern warlords, we have the Taliban in the south in Helmand province and along the mountains. So when they first arrived, John Service said that his first impression was, he likened it to one of the Christian Southern conferences in one of the Christian summer conferences he had attended with his missionary parents, because there was the same tinge of smugness, self-righteousness, and conscious fellowship among the Chinese communists, and they didn't have much sense of humor, and they all sort of had the same point of view. He had no idea how much had gone on from the time the Long March ended there in 36 and 44, where Mao had and another leader had been able to seize power from the more theoretical Leninists and create this new very strong doctrine and impose their own revolutionary art on the artists and intellectuals, and they were purged if they didn't follow this new line that he had created. But all of that happened before the Americans arrived. Nevertheless, John Service said the contrast between the atmosphere in Yan'an compared to the wartime capital in Chongqing, he said, it feels like we've come to a different country and are meeting a different people. Bodyguards, gendarmes, and claptrap of Chongqing officialdom are also completely lacking. When the first plane landed, it broke its propeller on this rough, crummy airstrip, and so the Chinese communists decided they should mobilize everybody to go out and build a better airstrip, and Service suggested that the Dixie Mission, as it was known, should go out and help too in a work brigade, and lo and behold, they lasted just a little bit of time, because when the Chinese saw the Americans working, they stopped to stare. They had never had an experience of seeing foreigners doing physical labor before. Service wrote and sent back reports. Here's Mao. The bald-headed guy is Barrett. This is Service over here. He wrote reports on everything from their concept of People's War to the Saturday night dances in the pear orchard where Mao's wife, former actress Zhang Jing, would dance with the Americans. They played games like Monopoly and Bridge, and a few days after they arrived, one of the communists shows up with a version of Monopoly based on Shanghai, which was like New York to the Chinese. They were able to be briefed by Chinese guerrillas. This man, for those of you who know Chinese history, is a man named Lin Biao, who attempted a coup in '71, we think, and his airplane headed towards Soviet Union and was shot out of the skies. I don't know a lot more. This is Service right here. But when they first arrived, they had a big dinner, and Mao sat with Barrett and Service and said, you know, to Service, I want you to get to know us, talk to anybody, we'll set you up to talk to and interview anyone. I want you to get to know us, and then you and I'll sit down and have a long conversation after you're here a month. So Service wrote a lot of reports, and he wanted to try and figure out why the morale could be so high in this place that was such a Spartan camp compared to the claptrap of officialdom in Chongqing. And he discovered, he wrote in his reports, that the key to the success was political indoctrination of and organization of the peasants with moderate economic and land reform, because they didn't want to turn off the landlords. They had learned their lesson from earlier days when they were so doctrinaire about all landlords are evil. And they also, in order to survive in this hostile country with very, I mean, it's sort of like the Midwest in the middle of the winter, kind of, Nebraska. Not to denigrate Nebraska, please, if you're from Nebraska. But he said that these were the essential ingredients for their successful guerrilla war and organization of an effective underground resistance. And he said that this was amounting to a revolution. And he predicted that if the nationalists did not go as far as the communists in reforms, then the Chinese Communist Party would become the dominant political force. Meanwhile, the OSS folks and the army people who were there to observe were very taken by the kind of activity and strength of the communists, who were well-fed and well-clothed, unlike a lot of the forces of the nationalists. Service in his travels around China saw recruits being tied together and marched out of their own provinces to far distant to become cannon fodder, because they didn't want them to stay in the same province they lived in. They'd run away. But the OSS had a plan to give 100,000 assassin weapons and outfit 20,000 guerrilla of the Chinese communists and work behind the lines. And these plans only came to light when the OSS files were declassified in the 1990s. There's an excellent book called OSS in China, if you're interested in that. Meanwhile, John Service and Barrett, they sent recommendations to give that it was for real, that they wanted to cooperate, they had the capability, they had a lot of POWs, Japanese POWs that they allowed the Americans to interrogate. They got a lot of good information. So he recommended that the U.S. give proportionate aid to the Chinese communists as well as give a lot of aid to the nationalists because his whole intent was to win the war against Japan. Finally, a month went by, and John Service, who's shown here with Mao and Ye Jianying, Judah, who was the commander-in-chief, and Zhou Enlai, who eventually became the premier in China. But he was called to Mao's cave, and they dug caves in the hillsides as protection against Japanese bombers, by the way. And they had an 8-hour talk. And a lot of historians and China watchers have debated whether or not there was a lost chance in China. I do not pretend to know for sure, but all I can say, it was an extraordinary talk. And the question is, was it just the opportunism of Mao trying to avoid a civil war before he was strong enough, that he was so encouraging and receptive to the Americans? I don't know. But as Barbara Tuchman, a noted historian, says, if we had tried to find out if Mao were serious or not, the outcome wouldn't have been any worse than happened in the post-war world. Mao said that they would cooperate, and they also wanted American businessmen to help rebuild his war-torn country, and he wanted very much, if they were given a political stake in the government and had a coalition government, they could avoid the Civil War and a lot of bloodshed. And he wanted American businessmen to come in joint ventures and help with the economic development of the country. And Service said, well, you know, a lot of capitalists are not going to feel comfortable talking to communists. And Mao said to him, well, you know, we've talked about changing our name, but we've decided that once people get to know us, they'll understand. Later, Mao said, now, are you going to take your report on, he took copious notes, are you going to go back on the next supply plane and tell them? He said, no, I'm just going to, I'll send it by code in the radio. And later, John Service, 20-some years later, said that was a big mistake. He said, here he was begging for American cooperation, and I didn't take it back personally. What happened is the report went back, it didn't get decoded, it didn't get to Washington for 2 more months, and fateful decisions had been already been made. And the only thing I can report for sure is that during the 27 years of animosity that followed the Civil War in China, neither side spoke about the cooperation that briefly flowered in Yan'an. Here's a group picture of the early Dixie Mission, and it was used in the anti-communist McCarthy era to say, look at these dupes. But the reason they're wearing the outfits, it's very cold where they were, and so they were given these homespun outfits to keep them warm. And what happened outside back in Chongqing was that there was this effort to get the command for all Allied troops in China. Chiang Kai-shek told Roosevelt, well, he would agree to that, but he needed a special representative to come and work out the details. And this wonderfully mustachioed man, Patrick Hurley, was appointed by FDR to work out the details, but he kept saying to Chiang, well, while you work out the details, let General Stilwell take command. That didn't happen. Hurley was turned around, and Chiang convinced him that it was just a clash of personalities with Vinegar Joe, who was he really was an abrupt, assertive, vinegary personality who did not kowtow to Chiang Kai-shek. And Stilwell was recalled to the United States as a result of advice from this gentleman and the request of Generalissimo Chiang Kai-shek. And Service up in the boondocks in Yan'an heard the rumors that this was going to happen. He wrote a very emotional, blunt, frank memo to his commander, Stilwell, who he was the political advisor for, and he said, we should end the hollow pretense that China is unified and that we can talk only to Jiang. This puts the trump card in Jiang's hands. Well, later that message was used by anti-communists and the nationalists to prove that Service was trying to sabotage the nationalist regime. As a result of his recall, Service was recalled to talk about the other China, and there was hope that there would really be a reevaluation of all China policy. And he went back to China, he went back to the United States feeling like a man with a mission, because he had discovered there were forces there. Some American pilots were rescued, brought out, and gave amazing accounts of their rescue by the Chinese communists and the way the villagers were protecting them. And so he was ready to go back and urge a realistic, pragmatic approach for the war and also for the stake of the future, because he was worrying about the fate of nations and what would happen after the war. But I have to stop the narrative long enough to bring in a very important thread of this story, and this is this woman who John Service met on a public bus in early 1944, and they developed a romance. His family had been evacuated 4 years earlier. She moved in with him. They only had one night together before he left from Yan'an, from Chongqing, to go back to report about what he learned in the other China. And he had already written to his wife asking for a divorce, and he told Val that he would come back a free man. The ambassador said, "Don't be a damn fool. Live with her if you will, but don't marry her. It will ruin your career. You can't be in the Foreign Service if you marry a foreign woman." He said, "I'll come back a war correspondent for one of the newspapers." Well, he got back, he saw his two children, realized he had family responsibilities, realized he loved his career and didn't want to jeopardize it, reconciled with his wife, who quickly got pregnant, never wrote to Val, and had left her pregnant too. Meanwhile, while he's going off to Washington, Hurley in his magnificent outfit goes to the ragtag communist headquarters, and he is going to bring peace and create a political settlement. He's a lawyer from Oklahoma, and he likens the nationalists and the Chinese communists to the Republicans and Democrats in his home state of Oklahoma. And the communists are just like the out-of-office grumbling Republicans, except that they have guns. This man would not listen to any background briefings before he went to China. He didn't even let Jack Service brief him about what he had discovered in Yan'an when they met before Service was sent back to the U.S. And he was so ignorant of Chinese customs and the fact that last names come first that he referred to Chiang Kai-shek's wife as Madam Shek. Nevertheless, he soldiered on with this abortive attempt at peace, and he first thought that the communist proposal for a peace settlement was very fair, and he was turned around by the nationalists. Nationalists were not going to compromise and share power with their arch enemy. You can see the eyes. These guys don't really like each other too much, and here is Hurley, who thinks he's going to get, if there were a Nobel Peace Prize, there wasn't, that he was going to be the guy who got it. Now, while all this is happening in August of 1945, John Service is back in Washington, and he went back a man with a mission. His higher-ups at the State Department and back channels at the White House urged him to spread the word about the other China and try and push for a change of policy. He did briefings at the War Department, the State Department, military intelligence. They set up interviews for him with different journalists, and he was introduced to the editor of a magazine journal called Amerasia. And unbeknownst to Jack Service, the FBI had the editor, the deputy editor, a naval intelligence officer, and another clerk at the State Department under surveillance, and it discovered they had been leaking government documents to this editor. The editor had been a strong pro-Soviet person who had funded a lot of Communist Front organizations. It was right at the time of the disillusionment with our Soviet allies from the war, because their tanks were rolling through Eastern Europe, the Iron Curtain was coming down, and John Service loaned a few of his reports from Yan'an to this guy Jaffe, and it created a terrible, terrible situation for him. And it was a web of suspicion that grew and grew out of proportion to the reality, and it lasted his entire life. I can't go into a lot of detail, except to tell you that he had help from this man who was a big influence peddler in Washington, who was going to get him a good lawyer, and instead was overheard on illegal wiretaps from the FBI, talking to top Justice Department officials, and J. Edgar Hoover never ever thought that J. Edgar Hoover had seen all this illegal wiretapping, and he believed that Service was a security risk, even though Service was really just a victim of circumstantial evidence and guilt by association with a bunch of people. There's a whole cast of characters in this book that's amazing. But when Service was first arrested, he admitted to the FBI interrogators that he had loaned 8 to 10 copies and that he immediately regretted it, and that he had gone, and their conversations were taped by a hidden microphone in the hotel room. I have to shorten this, so I've got to run through, but I got to come back here for just a second to say Hoover suspected there was a whitewash and a cover-up. Jack Service was found innocent and cleared of any charges by a secret grand jury, never stood trial. It would have been interesting had there been a trial. General Stilwell would have been called as a witness. He'd been muzzled by the White House and the War Department. But anyway, this whole issue of was there a whitewash and a cover-up and influence peddling came for 5 years, kept coming up, and then he found a great ally in this man, Senator Joseph McCarthy. Hoover leaked documents to him, and this is what McCarthy said the first time he spoke and talked about, I have in my hand 205 names of card-carrying communists in the government. He only named four people on this list, and one of them was John Service. This is what he said about Service. Service sent official reports back to the State Department during the war that we torpedo our ally Chiang Kai-shek, and stating in unqualified terms, and I quote, that communism is the only hope of China. Later, this man, John Service, and please remember that name, was picked up by the FBI for turning over to the communists secret State Department information. Strangely, however, he was never prosecuted. Today, ladies and gentlemen, this man Service is on his way to represent the State Department in Calcutta, by far and away the most important listening post in all of Asia. Well, he repeated these charges all the way across the country and then was called on the carpet in the Congress and say, okay, give us the names. And he fainted like the boxer he used to be, but for 8 hours he was on the Senate floor, and he used Service as a scapegoat for the loss of China to the communists. Meanwhile, the Service family was on their way to a new post in India, at the embassy, not in Calcutta. And they were at dinner one night with the freighter's captain when a crewman comes down and said, "Is your name John Stewart Service?" He says, "Yeah." And the crewman said, "Well, you better come up to the radio room. There's some senator talking about you." And that's how they discovered what was going on back in the United States. And he was soon got a cable from the State Department saying, come back for consultations. And so they decided the family should continue on the trip to India, and optimistically they thought he'll be able to straighten everything out in a couple of weeks, fly to India, and maybe be at the docks when the freighter landed a month later. And I'll give you one more quote from the book, and then I'll wrap it up, and I want to get to your questions because I'm afraid I'm over time for what we want to do. So let me just find it here. Carolyn from the ship wrote a letter to her parents, and her letters were a great source of information for me to kind of enrich and humanize this incredible story that involves a lot of historical events. But anyway, this is what she wrote after Jack had flown back to Washington and there on the ship going to India. This should be the final foray for Jack's bitter enemies, and everything should be at last cleared up. And the insinuations and the lies and the cruel persecution and the terrible thing of accusing a man of something he did not do and then never giving him a chance to defend himself should be over, Caroline wrote her parents in a long plaintive letter from Yokohama. We have had 5 years of it, and that is enough, too much. And all this because he and others had the courage to report the truth about China. Wistfully, she continued, if only we were still in Washington, all of this should have been cleared up then. Here we sit in the Pacific Ocean, able to do absolutely nothing, caught between the sea and the sky. Well, on they went on their way to India, and she was so upset and scared because the atmosphere in America, you cannot imagine. Students, ask your grandparents about it. It was extraordinary. She was so upset, she went into Jack's trunks that were left on the ship for their trip, found his Yan'an notebooks, and threw them overboard. Meanwhile, Service Goes Back gets caught up for the next over a year in dual hearings by the Loyalty Board of the State Department and a subcommittee of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, and he is proven innocent and not disloyal by both of those organizations. And then there's something called the Loyalty Review Board, which was set up by President Truman as a way of giving an appeal to someone who had been found guilty, to give them an appeal of last resort. And that was to maybe reverse a negative and find that they were not guilty. In Service's case, this politically infused organization overturned the positive and ordered the Secretary of State to fire him for doubtful loyalty, not disloyalty, doubtful loyalty. And in my research, I discovered that one of the real reasons he was fired, that was never made public, was that the nationalist Chinese intelligence agencies had spread disinformation that he had fathered an illegitimate child by his Soviet spy lover during the war. Anyway, he went through hell, and there's a lot of transcript of what happened. He tried to explain that his use of the word democracy in some of his reports about the Chinese communists was taken out of context in the newspapers and by McCarthy, and was a comparative way of talking about the Chinese nationalist areas and the Chinese communist areas, and not as compared to the United States. Eventually, 7 years later, he won reinstatement by a decision of the United States Supreme Court, but his career was always neutralized. And he went off to Berkeley and helped establish the Center for Chinese Studies as one of the best resources that we have on Chinese communism and China in general. Eventually, though, he was invited back as a signal to the U.S. that China wanted a better relationship with China wanted a better relationship with the United States 8 months before Nixon's trip. And he met secretly with Kissinger in Beijing on one of the follow-up trips that Kissinger made to set up the visit of Nixon. And he told, Kissinger asked him, what about Taiwan? How serious were the Chinese? And Service said, oh, it's very serious. This is not a bargaining chip. And Kissinger said, well, my people say it is. And he said, well, when I talked to Mao, and Kissinger said, you talked to Mao? And he said, well, would you be willing to come to San Clemente? And Service said, well, if anybody wants to talk to me, sure. Well, he never got called to San Clemente, and I interviewed one of Kissinger's aides many years later who said that the U.S.-China negotiations were so delicate, they had to be extremely careful not to inflame the China lobby, even if it meant not talking to the only American diplomat who had ever held substantive talks with Chairman Mao. By the end of his life, his reputation was restored. He was recognized as a China expert. He did a 4-part series on his first trip back to China for the New York Times. He was on the cover of Parade magazine. He was profiled in the New Yorker, and he got a lot of honorary degrees. And this is from the 1980s. He's wearing his gown, and next to him is his wife, Carolyn, and next to her is the actress, Val Chow. And if you want to know how that happened, ladies and gentlemen, you're going to have to read my book. Thank you very, very much for your attention. Thank you. I also have a great website that you can see a lot of these pictures on, and there are bookmarks out with the books, and it has the honorablesurvivor.com website listed. And while you all go get your food, I'm going to just flick through a couple more slides that I didn't have time to get to because I want to give everyone a chance to eat and come back and answer questions. So if you just turn your head as I do this while you're in line for the food, you'll be able to see. I went back to Yan'an in 2004, and in Yan'an these days they are doing what I call selling the past. And you can buy postcards with pictures of the old revolutionary cadres, and you can even rent the uniforms of the World War II Communist Army, the 8th Route Army as it was known, and have your picture taken by your mom standing in these rented uniforms by an idealized picture of Mao. Because I'm sure you're aware that the Communist Party has pretty much lost any credibility as a viable ideology, but they are able to maintain their one-party control, and they do it because they have been able to create a very amazing economic program. And the irony to me is that a lot of what they are doing, as outlined first in '78 when Deng Xiaoping opened to the West, was invite foreign businessmen in to go into joint ventures with the Chinese communists, just as Mao talked to John Service in 1944 about doing. So it's kind of an interesting situation that has developed in China, and the U.S.-China relationship continues to be extraordinarily important for us and for the world. President Obama is going in a few weeks for his first visit to China, and I'm hoping that this cautionary tale about China and America, because I think it's also very much a story about America, and at a time when we have our Patriot Act, an invasion of privacy rights by citizens in our country, it is also a cautionary tale for domestic reasons here in the United States, and I hope it's just a good story, and I hope you'll enjoy it. If anyone has a question while we're waiting, I have a pretty loud voice so people can hear me if they want.
Just a general question about the...
Could you identify yourself,
Yeah, Bill
sir?
Kurtz, I keep journals.
Bill, I'm sorry.
Kurtz, K-I-R-T-Z.
Yeah.
We know a fair amount about the press and McCarthyism. Are there any specific wrinkles or interesting wrinkles about the service and Vaughn and some of those other people, the Who Lost China group, that you want to talk about, how the press covered them?
Well, the press was very divided in the United States. It was a very partisan press. I guess we could say it still is a very partisan, divided press. And J. Edgar Hoover, on the one hand, when people like Service's lawyer would ask for a copy of his statement that he'd given to the FBI, refused it, said that's not public. On the other hand, he had special cronies in the press who he didn't mind leaking things to. And he didn't mind, not only did he leak stuff to McCarthy, he lent McCarthy agents, secretaries, and his press relations guy who wrote his press releases. In the 1950s, when Service was undergoing these investigations and hearings at the Senate and the State Department, and it was leaked that there were these hotel conversations with the editor of Amerasia, both investigative bodies asked to see the transcripts, and the Justice Department lawyers ruled that since they had been illegally obtained, they could not be sent to those bodies. But he did give it to, snippets of it, to McCarthy and other politicians on Capitol Hill and to right-wing newspaper people. And on the bottom of the report from one of his agents that the lawyers at the Justice Department had ruled against giving this information, in his handwriting, and I have copies of this, Hoover scrawled, "I want everything out about Service. This is an administrative hearing, not a court of law, and the rules of evidence do not apply." So that's the kind of amazing situation we faced in this country in the 1950s, and an abuse of power that was incredible. So I hope that answers your question, Professor Kurtz. It was pretty nasty, but there's a lot of documented evidence in it. Yeah, I said there was a partisan press. The leaks, the majority of them favored the anti-communist right-wing press, but no, Drew Pearson interviewed Jack Service and others like John Carter Vinson, got leaked material from them. I mean, we still have a game of leaking. Who do you think gave Mr. General McChrystal's report on what his troop level desires were? Somebody leaked that, and for very political purposes, even today. So this is an old game. The question is, can we learn the lessons of the past so we don't repeat them now? I'm not so sure. Any other questions right now? Okay.
I have a question just a little bit more about sort of his family relationships, and did Valchon end up having a child, and did they?
A lot of people want me to tell you what happened. I will only tell you that there was no child fathered illegitimately by Service. That is all I will tell you. But it's quite interesting what does happen, and I will tell you that Val Chow is still alive, and I've interviewed her, and she lives in California, and she's delighted. She learned a lot because Val Chow went back, well, you don't know it, but Val Chow came to the United States on a grant to study drama at Yale University. And so she was here, and she had her illegitimate child in the United States. It was conceived overseas. And the FBI was so sure that it must be Service's child, even though the child was born 17 months after John Service left China. You're not going to believe this, but the FBI sent investigators out to see if there might have been a secret liaison somewhere between Tokyo, where John Service was then on the staff of General MacArthur, and Shanghai, where Val Chow was. And guess what? There was no secret liaison between them. But I really don't want to give away too much of that part of the story, because people are always but that's the point. I tried to weave a story that gives you the history and the personalities and the human side, because a lot of the material that I gathered only has been declassified since then, and it took me 4 years to get a lot of stuff from the FBI and the State Department. So it's been a long time. I actually started working in the FBI in a windowless room in 1999, and I was working part-time at that time. I worked as a consultant at Radio Free Asia, and then I got a job as the director of the International Journalism Awards Program at Johns Hopkins School of Advanced International Studies, which was a wonderful way I could give money and awards to journalists from all over the world and bring them to Washington to present their work. It was an excellent thing. But finally I got to the point where I really needed to work on this book. And I also had some health issues I had to overcome. So I stopped working on outside things. I sold my house so I could afford to live without a paycheck. So please buy my book. Yes, ma'am.
Did you know that Val was in this country?
Oh, yes.
Oh, you knew, so you were able to find her?
Oh, I knew her because, well, you saw the picture of her with John and Carolyn Service, so I've known about Val since the 1970s.
But you knew she was here?
And I knew that she used to visit them in Berkeley.
Oh, you didn't say?
Well, I don't have time to tell you everything, but it's in the
away.
book. Yes.
I grew up in China, so I felt that
Wan Yin, Wan Yin.
Yeah, I felt that your story was really fascinating. And also because all of the, his experience in baseball never really Chinese. At least when I was in China.
Could you speak up, please?
I don't know now, people heard about him or not, I don't know. But
Somebody asked if you could talk a little louder.
Oh, okay. First, I grew up in China, so I felt that his story was very fascinating, and I never heard anything about John Service because most of the historical stories in the 40s was not released for the public in China. So I'm just wondering, if the author knows what's going on now or what. But my question is, I know most of part of your book based on interview of the John Service. Did you do any archive work in China?
No, I did not do any archive work in China. I do not speak, I mean, I speak a little Chinese. I cannot read it, unfortunately. I knew 500 characters at one point, and that's ancient history. In my next life, though, I will. Actually, John Service and his family are well known in certain circles, intellectual circles of China. And when I was there and visited Yan'an in 2004, there was a documentary film crew from CCTV, and they were doing a story about Yan'an. The thing about the Dixie Mission, after the opening by Nixon, the veterans of the Dixie Mission were invited back because there was a real propaganda campaign in China for better relations with the U.S. because of their fear of the Soviet Union. And even today, you know to test the political winds in China. And when China wants better relations with the United States, they resurrect the Yan'an spirit. They have had periodic reunions, and it's a wonderful, it has been in the past, after the years of animosity and persecution on both sides by people who participated in that. I had a man yesterday in New York where I spoke come up to me and tell me that his grandfather was in those occupied areas and helped make leather shoes to outfit the rescued pilots. And during the Cultural Revolution, he was roundly criticized and tortured because he had helped and the bourgeois and had made him leather, not straw, but leather shoes. So there's this love-hate thing that has gone on for a long, long time. And I think that we need to be aware of that. When John Service came back from his first trip, his Chinese name is Xie Weizhi, so you may have heard of that, okay? There is a museum to General Stilwell in Chongqing. It has a lot of old photographs. In Yan'an, there is a museum to the Revolutionary era and lots of fascinating photographs. And on one wall, there are a couple of the pictures that I showed you of the Americans in Yan'an during those days. But during the 27 years of animosity, there were no pictures like that on the wall. And they talked about the running dogs of imperialism. But there was a lot of disillusionment on the part of the Chinese communists who were trying to figure out American policy, because it was, on the one hand, there were people like John Service and the Army. On the other hand, there was General Early, who was sure that his own foreign service officers and military people were sabotaging. And he took it into his own head that his mission was to preserve Chiang Kai-shek in power. And that was never, when you go back and look at the historical record, ever the policy of the United States. It was the interpretation of one man who, FDR said, if there's one man who can figure out the internal political problems of China, it's Pat Hurley. And he told his son, boy, I wish I had more men like Pat Hurley. And I think one of the reasons he felt that way is here was a man, a president, who was a polio cripple, and most Americans never saw him in his wheelchair or never saw his metal braces on his legs. But he really loved those larger-than-life swashbuckling characters like Pat Hurley and Wild Bill Donovan, who was the head of the OSS. And so he lived vicariously through them. And Hurley was always sure that the communists and the nationalists had the same aims and the same desire for democracy. And because they spoke the same words, he didn't understand how to nuance that at all. Yes?
Can you talk a little more about the process of doing the research? I know that sometimes you'll see something in the FBI files that are different to what you've heard in an interview, maybe, that might be different to the newspapers as well.
Yeah.
How did you were there those discrepancies, and how did you resolve them? And did you like the people that you were researching?
I would never have spent 10 years of my life. I mean, I come out of TV news and documentary. The longest I ever spent on a documentary film was to do a documentary in the Soviet Union at the height of the Cold War, when I followed a trek of 10 young Americans and 10 young Soviets to the top of a 19,000-foot high mountain, the highest summit in Europe, to show that Americans and Soviets could learn to trust each other and reach a common goal. That took 18 months of negotiating with the Soviets to get permission to bring in a film crew and everything. I never, ever thought this would take this long. But let me give you a couple of tips about the research. And again, I've never done a book before. I'm going to be speaking at the National Archives in Washington, and I plan to spend a lot of the time talking about the research process. But let me just tell you, I had to try and figure out how to come to grips with all this. And I created a chart. And the chart, the first column was narrow, and it had the day and the date of something that happened in John Service's life, starting, back in 1909 when he was born. The middle column was information that I found in my research, say the letters from Caroline, and I would date it, and I'd always put your citation, always. When you're taking your notes, put that citation, because sometimes I didn't, and then it was, when I was trying to do my footnotes, it was heck trying to go back and find what the source was. The third column was when I'd read something else that had to do with the same topic, I'd put it in that other column. Or my own observations after I read something else. I'd say, see page blah blah of this, or oh my goodness, Service thought this was happening, but really this is what Hoover was doing behind the scenes. And there was a terrible turf battle between the Justice Department, which claimed that the FBI had bungled the investigation of the Amerasia case, and that's why no one ever went to trial. And the FBI, who was pissed off because they felt that they had fully informed the criminal justice department's head attorney about this thing. So there were lots of strands to come together. And boy, I tell you, that chart was incredible. What I also learned, though, is a chart, you can't put as much information into one chart. I had to do separate charts for certain years that were jam-packed. And for a year as jam-packed as 1945, I had to have a chart that went from January to June, and then from June to October, and then October to November. So it was quite a process to go through that. But it was the smartest thing I ever figured out to do. And then I could search it, too. I could, go Control Find, look for a name or an event, and while I was writing, go back and find it. I also kept a, when I get these big, thick copies of FBI documents, and there was a lot of blackouts. Now, in the old days, they blacked out with a black felt tip pen, and sometimes you could hold it up to the light and actually see through it. Now they're redacting by using that whiteout in the computer, and it's gone. Very frustrating. But I could figure out who they were talking about, another one of the suspects in the Amerasia case who was a journalist. And so I appealed and said, why are you blacking out this guy's name and telling me it's, I don't know what's happening. I guess I can close this down. But I'll leave that for now. I don't want to deal with that. I sent them two Google pages with this man's name, showing that there were headline stories about this man and the Amerasia case, and I got a snippy reply from the Freedom of Information Act office saying, "No, we don't know he's really dead. You have to give us a certificate of his death." They're very Neanderthal. Now, according to the Obama administration, they are now trying to make all of the departments more proactive rather than reactive, and it's supposed to become easy. So one of the things I hope to do is write a story about my experiences. I have some very funny quotes from the FBI. The FBI people lost my files, my requests, and I, thank God, got befriended by one person in the public relations media office who physically went up to the department, found a clerk, and together they went into a back storeroom and found where my box had been just thrown. Now, on top of that, at the State Department, at one point I got a call from their FOIA office saying, Lynn, our security office is stonewalling us. By law, the files of any Foreign Service officer who retires, 25 years after their retirement, all of their files, their personnel files, security files, all of them should go to the National Archives. Well, I was allowed to walk into the back stacks with an archival historian from the National Archives looking for services files. And we found big holes in the files. And it turned out what we discovered and with persistence got hold of, the security office of the State Department, because his whole file was so sensitive, had been so sensitive 50 years ago, and because of these charges of an illegitimate child and all the hanky-panky of the FBI and everything, they never sent it over. Finally, they sent it over under pressure from us. And I got a call from the archivist at College Park, where the archives are, saying, we've got it, it's going to take us 3 months to kind of organize it, but you'll be called and we'll tell you when you can come in and go through it. I get the call, I go down. There are 25 boxes, this big, of file folders. And the State Department has done an entire, over the years, they kept what they called a summary and analysis of his case. And that took up the first 10 boxes. And it had quotes from FBI memos and military intelligence stuff and testimony at the Senate hearings and the State Department stuff. And then it was all annotated, and it told me where in the 15 boxes of appendix I could find the actual stuff. And so thank God the left hand and the right hand of the government do not know what they're doing, because none of that was redacted. So that's where I found out about these secret nationalist Chinese intelligence reports that were sent to anti-communist politicians and to J. Edgar Hoover, and then J. Edgar Hoover had them hand-delivered to important officials in the government and to important anti-communist politicians with a breathless cover memo saying, these have come out of the files of Chiang Kai-shek's intelligence, as if that made it true. And that, was a very great thing for me. Now, how you do it in the future, I don't know. There's been a lot of abuse of files, especially under the last president. And he has tried to protect his father's presidential files and his own. So I don't know, but I can tell you that you better love your subject or don't start. Okay?
Time for one more question, and we're going to do the sign.
Oh, yeah. Oh,
if there are
yeah.
any other questions.
Yes. It's hard to see you.
You can talk a little bit about the role of the Soviet Union, the role of the Soviet Union between China and the United States. So you talk about the America's loss of China, and if that was the case, then it seems to me that the Soviet Union has fund China or gained China.
Had what?
Had fund China or fund China and gain China.
Okay.
Or it's because Stalin at the very beginning was not that ready to accept China or support Mao. So
Exactly true. As I say, I've had to give a very brief account of things. There's more in the book. The fact of the matter is the Soviet Union is the only country that gave aid to the nationalist Chinese in the early years of the war with Japan. They were the only country. The Soviet Union, because they were the big brother socialist country, were a model. And their European industrial style revolution was first tried in China and failed because 90% of the people live in the countryside. During the time that they were in Yan'an, George Kennan, who's the architect of our containment policy for the Soviet Union, was in the Soviet Union, and he was called upon as an expert witness to read Jack Service's dispatches during the loyalty hearings. And he said these are not the reports of a man with a closed mind who's a communist. He thought they were very fair. He said, but he only knew what was going on in China. But he said, you know, the Chinese were able, because they were so isolated and because Stalin was so concerned about the Nazi invasion of the Soviet Union, and because the Komintern, which was their special international group who were out there to zealously spread the word about the ideology, and they had made great strides within the industrialized European countries to create communist parties that they really did have control over. They had more control over the Europeans and even the American Communist Party than they ever had in China. And the Chinese and Mao really resented the fact that the Soviets had not helped support them. And they were freer to develop their own brand of communism. Okay? Essentially what a number of the American diplomats in World War II were arguing is, if we can help nurture the nationalism of the Chinese communists, we can keep them independent of the influence of Big Brother Russia. And they were looking beyond the war because there would be a power vacuum after Japan was defeated. And one of the things that Service was hoping is, had the plans to ally with the communists gone through, it would have meant there would have been American officers embedded with Chinese guerrilla groups at the end of the war. And therefore, they would have helped take the surrender of the Japanese, instead of having a ludicrous order from Chiang Kai-shek telling the Japanese not to surrender to the communists. The other factor that Jack and the other China hands were trying to point out is, had we been there, then the Soviets would not have been so bold to stay in Manchuria as long as they did, and to rape that industrial area of China, which everyone was hoping would be the seed for the development of China's reconstruction. They took all the heavy equipment out and took it to the Soviet Union, which was devastated because of the Nazis. And if the Americans had been boots on the ground, if you will, with the communists in that race to take surrender, maybe the Russians wouldn't have been so successful. But the fact of the matter is, FDR made a secret deal with the Russians at Yalta. And I really can't go into that now. But it's very important to this, the incorrect assumptions upon which we base our policy. And it's a tragedy. And it can happen all the time because personalities kind of get involved in this. And one of the things John Service in his dispatches would say, you know, we have to have a coherent policy. We've got too many different actors in China, and there isn't this coherence. If you Google, you can find a book of his World War II dispatches called Lost Chance in China. It was written in it was edited in 1974 by a man named E.J. Kahn, and you can find it at Amazon under used books. It's in paperback and hardback, and I highly recommend if you're interested in it, because there's all kinds of stuff about his views about Soviet Union and so forth. But anyone who's out in the field as he is knows that he can only see a very small part of the picture. We're all like blind men looking at an elephant. And what we need is people in Washington who will actually listen to the field reports and have the wisdom to put it together and see a bigger picture. And the irony and the tragedy for me about John Service and other old China hands who were accused of having lost China as if China were America's to lose, is that John Service really did get his views to the highest levels. He was encouraged to give, he was so brilliant in his writing, his reports were commended and sent to the White House officially by the State Department, and then through these back channels, because every faction in China had back channels to the White House where the real foreign policy issues were decided by Roosevelt and his confidant Harry Hopkins. He got his views heard there. When he came back from Yan'an, he had a meeting with Harry Hopkins in Hopkins' very crowded office in the basement of the White House, and there was no room to roll out this map that the communists had given him on the desk. So he got down on his hands and knees and for 45 minutes briefed Harry Hopkins on the placement of where the Japanese troops were, what, based on observations of the Chinese communist guerrillas, where the communist guerrilla operations were, where their base camps were, where they controlled and they could walk around freely during the day and not be hidden, and where they were building secret airstrips for American troops that might be landed there as part of the big push to the Japanese islands. They were disguising them as children's playgrounds in the villages. And when he finished, Hopkins said, "Well, I'm sure everything you've told me, young man, is probably true. It's just a shame they call themselves communists. The only Chinese Americans have ever heard of is Chiang Kai-shek." That was the end of it. Now, what I also discovered, and I don't remember if I put much of this in the book or not, Chinese always are very good at cultivating relationships, and they're very long-term in their planning. And so the nationalist Chinese and Zhang's in-laws, the Sung family, who were very influential, as our Chinese friends here in the audience know, they started sending beautiful gifts to Harry Hopkins, to President Roosevelt, to the Secretary of the Treasury, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, back in 1935, so that by 45, these were friends. And sometimes we don't always make the most rational, intelligent decisions based on what's important so much as what we're comfortable with. So anyway, you've been wonderfully attentive. Thank you very much.